Well, you know how some people rub you up the wrong way. You know, public figures that annoy you, that disrupt your day, that you can't stand hearing. You turn off the radio or television as soon as they appear. In terms of public figures, people like that for me are Kevin Rudd, Malcolm Turnbull in particular, Daniel Andrews mostly. They all drive me nuts. I've got nothing in common with them. Everything they say is loaded with narcissism, and yet the media give them ample space to communicate, and it's just irritating. Well, I think I've discovered a new annoyance, and maybe you have too. A new entrant in the public sphere that says nothing but drivel and aggravates the hell out of me. It's one of the Teals. Monique Ryan, who took Kooyong away from Josh Frydenberg in May. Have you noticed what I've noticed? Ryan is a pain in the rear end. She thinks that because she's a child neurologist, she's some kind of medical genius. She thinks she knows everything there is to know about COVID-19, in particular COVID-19. She's a neurologist. Remember when we lifted the mask mandates? She roared in Parliament about how terrible the coalition was because they chose to distance themselves from their colleagues and therefore ditch the masks. That's what you were entitled to do. But that was just not on, according to this Teal, come Greenie, come lefty medic. Remember this?
The oncoming national significant burden of disability and chronic illness. Put your masks on. From repeated infection.
And then a few days later, she ended up being caught out by a random camera, partying without a mask on, very close to her partying friends. A hypocrite. Now, this pain in the butt, this know-it-all, this fake independent is at it again. After all members of the National Cabinet on Friday agreed with the New South Wales Premier's argument that isolation for the healthy should end, well, she couldn't help herself. Now, bear in mind, this unanimous decision is months after the US made the same ruling. It's many more months after the UK and Sweden did the same thing. And it's in line with what other countries are doing every other day of the week, dropping isolation unless you're unwell. If you're asymptomatic, get on with life. So instead of having COVID and isolating for 5 days, whether you're sick or not, we now have a decision which will be brought in on October 14 that ensures those who are sick stay at home. That hasn't changed. And those who are not, they can get on with life. No more mass absenteeism at workplaces. We keep masks at the ready, no problem. We keep our distance. We use sanitizer. We just get on with it. It'll save businesses millions. It'll assist in maintaining supply chains. And it's an obvious product of a high vaccination rate and a reduction in the COVID infection rate. But this Monique Ryan had to kick up a stink, didn't she? She knew better than all the premiers, all the chief ministers with their teams of medical health experts. She wrote on Twitter late Friday, quote, "The National Cabinet must not pretend the decision to scrap mandatory COVID-19 isolation is evidence-based. The public has a right to know how and why this decision was made." Well, it wasn't primarily health evidence-based, Dr. Ryan, because there are other considerations as well now that we are 2.5 years through this pandemic. So she has no concern for the economic world, which must be considered, or what isolation does to the mentally vulnerable, which must be considered. And, of course, most Greenie lefties don't consider that because they have no skin in the game. They work and earn whether the economy is suffering or not, usually. Well, can I just point out to Monique that the Chief Medical Officer, Paul Kelly, said it was time to move away from COVID exceptionalism and the emergency response phase is probably finished. That's not good enough for Monique Ryan. He's only Australia's Chief Medical Officer. He's using his knowledge of the state of this pandemic to say, quote, "The country is now in a very low community transition phase of the pandemic here in Australia." But the bedwetting Teal did find herself a real medical expert who agreed with her. The Burnett Institute's Professor Brendan Crabb was not only critical of Friday's universal decision, he was predicting a worse COVID spike than we've seen in 3 years.
COVID is still here. It's a major threat. The new wave is coming. There's every chance it'll be worse than the last wave. We're on track for 25,000 Australians to die this year, more than would usually have died. I mean, it's an extraordinary death toll. They need to know that. And the good news is we can do things about it.
So have you heard that before? I haven't heard it from anyone, that we're going to have a worse period of COVID than what we've had before. That is huge news. but he's the only one who believes it. Oh, and probably Monique Ryan. A bigger spike than anything before, really? Even with record vaccination rates, even as summer approaches, which we know drives down infection, even with masks at the ready, with sanitiser in the car and at home, and social distancing. Come on. Epidemiologist Peter Collignon disagrees. He says dropping isolation for the asymptomatic, quote, won't make a lot of difference because there's a lot of asymptomatic spread out there anyway. We haven't ditched isolation. It still applies to those who are ill from COVID-19. The rest should get on with their work and lives. Monique Ryan is quickly emerging as the Parliament's worst pain in the butt. I don't like her. I don't like what she stands for. I don't like her supremacy syndrome. And I'm hoping the people of Kooyong are watching very, very carefully.